my name is Stefan Korshak. I'm the senior defense correspondent of Kyiv Post newspaper, and we are here this morning with Luke Coffey and Peter Rao of the Hudson Institute. We're very glad to have them here, and they've agreed to answer a couple of questions. So, gentlemen, if you don't mind, I'll hit you with the hardest ones first. Your view from the United States, up on high. How is this war going to end, and when is it going to end? Your opinion, please.
Well, thanks for having us here today at Kyiv Post newspaper. The war will end sooner if America starts providing the necessary equipment and munitions that are required to ensure a decisive Ukrainian victory on the battlefield. But that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are just dependent on American aid and assistance. I think in the past few days being on the ground here, Peter and I have learned that the spirit of the Ukrainian people, the resilience, the bravery of the Ukrainian people demonstrate that they will see this through. They will ensure victory, whether they have support from the United States or not. However, if we in America want to end this war faster, we need to give the Ukrainians the equipment that they need. Basically, we need to want the Ukrainians to win more than we just hope that the Russians will lose.
Yep, that's an opinion that a lot of people here in Ukraine seem to share. That leads on, I think, fairly smoothly to the next question. There's a lot of people in Ukraine that seem to think that the Americans in NATO are willing to provide Ukraine a level of material support so that Ukraine can stabilize the lines and keep the Russians from winning, but not enough to defeat the Russians, or at least at minimum, force the Russians out of Ukraine. So, in your view, what do you think that Ukraine needs in a material sense in order to achieve those goals?
Well, in a way, I think we can call it a strategy of confinement that the West has been pursuing, confining to the war to Ukraine so it does not spill over onto NATO territory. And that means that the West has been willing and able and prepared to supply Ukraine just enough so that Kyiv won't fall, so that, if we can call it vital Ukraine almost, everything west of the river will remain standing, but not so far that the Ukrainians can actually take the fight to the Russians all the way up to the Russian border and liberate their entire country. And I think that really has been the pattern and structure of Western, in particular, American assistance to Ukraine. The actual agenda items that are up for discussion between the West and Ukraine, I think, are relatively clear and well known. Long-range fires, for example. There's been a debate in Washington about the so-called ATACMS missile system that would allow Ukraine to range further against Russian supply lines. There's talk of course, fighter jets and a fighter jet training program that the Ukrainians would like, and so forth and so on. Unmanned aerial vehicles, there have, of course, been some provided to the Ukrainians, but there's an entirely different class of systems that Ukraine would like to be able to operate in the Black Sea, for example, or hit the Russians further behind their lines. So all of this, I think, are rather technical discussions about what in particular main battle tanks the Ukrainians might want. What really matters is, I think, what you started your question with, which is the general mindset. We need to empower Ukraine to victory. We need to think about Ukrainian victory, because otherwise this will just take the path or pattern of the way the Russians like to wage war: freeze conflicts, reopen them, have ceasefire talks, then when the moment is advantageous for them, again attack. And so rather than confining the war to Ukraine, which really condemns Ukraine to perpetual conflict, we need to think about what is required for Ukraine to achieve victory and set our policy in that direction.
That's a great answer. Thank you. But that leads on to another question, which is, if you will, the definition of we. And there's a lot of players in the decision-making process to decide what kind of support Ukraine might get and the scale of that support. One of the key parts of that we is, of course, the United States Congress, which, as you are well aware, has just changed its makeup somewhat. And, of course, now the Biden administration is in its second 2 years of its administration. In your view, both from the internal domestic American political point of view and also in terms of how those processes would link in with the way that Europe is looking at this conflict, do you see any substantial changes in the way that Ukraine is going to receive support, more or less?
Well, it's a little unclear how it will all unfold since we are just now moving toward a new Congress. But I will say that in general, American foreign policy is the domain of the executive and the president. And only in the past, I would say, when American foreign policy has really veered off the train tracks, has Congress involved itself aggressively. And there I'm talking about, wars that the Americans have lost. Go back to Vietnam. I think the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which empowered the president, came in August of 1964. Not until 1971 was that essentially ended. In Iraq, the invasion took place on March 19th, 2003, and not for another 4 years were there tough hearings in Congress. This isn't a war the Americans are losing. For one, the Americans aren't shedding any blood. In fact, the Ukrainians have extraordinary victories, which I think are helping generate and sustain momentum from Kharkiv to Kyiv, now to Kherson. And so I expect that the United States will continue to stay strong in this conflict. And as for the Europeans, I think how the Americans behave as kind of the cornerstone ally, the cornerstone actor in the alliance, is going to be crucial to European support. So some Europeans have done extraordinary work, really kind of Leviathan efforts, if we think about the Poles or the Baltic states. Others have lagged a little bit, and I think it's up to the United States to kind of rally the alliance together to make sure that assistance continues.
And to add to that, of course, there has been concern about the House of Representatives flipping to the Republicans, because there have been a few very vocal Republicans in opposition to more Ukraine aid. But I do want to stress that these members of Congress are very much in the minority. I do believe that there's still a strong bipartisan support in Congress to support Ukraine. And those in Congress who are advocating to cut U.S. support to Ukraine, they're the ones who are actually out of touch with the American people. Polling shows consistently that the American people overwhelmingly support the Ukrainian people in their fight, in their right of self-defense. I saw one poll recently that said 63% of Americans said that they would be willing to spend more at the gas pump and the grocery store if it meant helping Ukraine. And I travel outside D.C. quite a bit. I go to my home state in Missouri in the middle of nowhere, and I see Ukrainian flags. I go fishing up in the Shenandoah Mountains in places where you cannot even get a mobile phone reception, and I see Ukrainian flags. Americans instinctively support the underdog, and everyone is supporting Ukraine.
And I would just add one point to that. There's a lot of focus put on some of these sort of pseudo-isolationist forces who have made very loud statements about cutting aid. But I would also say, if there is pressure put on the Ukrainians in a ceasefire negotiation by the administration, there will also be members of Congress who will hit from the other side, saying, no, it's important not to pressure the Ukrainians, but in fact allow them to run the strategy as they wish, and it's our job to support them so long as it wants to stay in the fight.
Okay, that leaves only one, I think, last question, and that is, you all have been here in Ukraine, and it's we've been here for the duration, and a lot of stuff is we're not even noticing it. What are your impressions? What have you been doing here, and what have you seen? What's your visit to Ukraine? What has that left you with, do you think?
Yeah, well, we've been here for a couple of days. This is my first time back to Kyiv since the war started. I'm just impressed, and I'm in awe of like I said, the resiliency of the Ukrainian people, the toughness, the bravery. You walk around Kyiv, and for the most part, all things considered, the situation seems positive. People are in high spirits. You see the traffic. I thought maybe I'd come back to Kyiv and you wouldn't have the traffic problems. Well, traffic seems to be back. I understand there are a lot of Ukrainians experiencing hardships, especially with rolling blackouts and limited electricity and heating, and especially as we approach the winter months. I'm going to leave from this visit feeling very positive about what the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian society will achieve in the coming months, especially if their partners like the Americans can help them even more get the Russians out from their land.
Yesterday we had a chance to go to Bucha, and I think there were two impressions that stuck at least with me from that visit. The first is that the Russians truly behave like animals, and I think the world needs to know that, and there's nothing like going to Bucha to see that firsthand. Yeah. But the second impression I had in meetings with city officials in Bucha is that they do not want to be defined as a place of tragedy, and they'd like to rebuild their future. They'd like to become a leafy, sort of pine-forested suburb once more that middle and upper middle class can live their lives and enjoy their lives, encourage families to return at some point to Bucha and have it be known for more than just the site of a Russian massacre. And I think that really is a worthy story, to not allow yourself to be defined by the war, but to try to not only bring life back to what it was before, but even make it better. And the tenacity, the courage, the impressiveness of the Ukrainian people, that's something that's really only palpable when you're in country and that you can't really read in the newspapers from abroad. So we're very grateful for the hospitality that we've experienced here and the meetings we've been allowed to have.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Luke Coffey, Peter Ruff, Hudson Institute. My name is Stefan Korshak, Kyiv Post newspaper. You all have a great day.